Okay.
So as I've said, so this is a webinar 11, and our goal here is to allow highly seasoned OSR experts to pass on their knowledge to the world, and we're going to capture it with this recording and to make it available through a link that's been sent to everybody who's attending or who's been invited actually to review if you weren't able to attend. So there is a link to the webinars that we've already done. If you have trouble finding that link, let me know. We're doing these every month, and it's the first Tuesday of the month, and we start at 10 a.m. Houston time, Central Time, and we've been going to about 11:30 because of the robust questions that we've had. And as I continue, we have a lot of interesting topics still and speakers on the schedule for the next, gosh, maybe 4 or 5 months now. I think we have people pinpointed, but we're going to continue this webinar series indefinitely as long as I can find people who have interesting things to speak and are willing to speak. So we have an hour or so, as I told Ed, for his presentation, and then it's been up right around 30 minutes every time that we've had questions, and then we kind of run out of steam. So we'll be here for an hour and a half or so. The attendees are able, hopefully, I think so far so good, to communicate their questions. So as Ed speaks, go on to the Q&A, hit the Q&A button, and it should pull up a little window, and you can type in your questions as he goes through his slides, and then at the end I'll read those questions off to Ed, and we'll try to answer as many as we can. And this recording, as I said, is being recorded, but it usually takes 2 to 4 weeks for us to get the recording put together and to get it onto the website so everyone can view it. So the old recordings, I think, are up now. Not sure about last month's, but it should be up soon, and it'll probably take a few weeks for this one to get up as well. So let's move on to the speaker. I think probably everyone online knows Ed Owens. He's been around a long time. He told me he's over 60 years old. We were discussing beforehand, but I won't say exactly how old he is, but he can volunteer that if he wants to. He has over 50 years of experience in marine and inland oil spill response and training worldwide, and was a technical advisor to Exxon USA for the Shoreline response to the Valdez incident, during which he developed the Shoreline Cleanup Assessment Technique, SCAT, concept, and he was busy with BP Shoreline response to Deepwater Horizon incident as well. Ed has worked on spill-related inland, river, and coastal projects throughout North and South America, the Middle East, the Black Caspian Sea, as well as Africa, Australia, New Zealand, and Russia. We should just say the entire world, and almost looks like Antarctica is not in there yet. And
yeah, Antarctica's not in there yet.
Got to visit Antarctica or find a reason to go down there and look at the shoreline. He has conducted oil spill related missions for the UN, the IMO, GI WACAP, World Bank, EBRD, and was a member of the U.S. National Academy of Science Oil Spill R&D Committee. He has provided oil spill planning and preparedness training worldwide and has authored more than 300 publications, which is amazing, on oil spill related topics. So this is his second talk, and I imagine Ed has very interesting things, and we could continue with other topics for Ed. But Ed has volunteered to speak again because he was very involved in the BIOS and the ITOSS oil shoreline field experiments, and he's going to tell us about those. So Ed, I'm going to pass it on to you, and thanks very much for speaking today.
Thank you, Tim. My pleasure. Actually, it was great to go back and look at some of the data that you know what the results were, having used the results of these experiments several times, but then to go back and actually look at the data was really instructive for me, and hopefully I got some nuggets to pass on for everybody who's listening in here today. The two experiments, Baffin Island oil spill experiment, we call it BIOS, was it took place over 3 years, 1980 to 83, and there was continued monitoring up to most recently 2019. The in situ treatment of oil shoreline sediments, the ITOSS experiment, took place in Svalbard in 1997 and 98. Just to give you an idea of location, on the left, at 72 degrees north is Cape Hat on Baffin Island. And on the right-hand circle is Svea in Svalbard at 78 degrees north. 78 degrees north when we were there was getting close to the edge of the Arctic pack ice, even in midsummer. The world has changed since then a little bit. The purpose of this presentation is to look at these two very large-scale field experiments quickly, because they did provide us with on each occasion a much better understanding. They were important steps in understanding about natural processes and the role of a shoreline cleanup or intervention on oil shorelines. I thought it was an easy job, but having looked at what we produced and with things that I'll show you, there's no way you can do justice really in 30 minutes to each of these two projects because of the design and the data and all the conclusions. So really what I'm going to try and do is steer you in the right direction to tell you where you can go. I'll give you the headlines, the highlights, but then when you have the time and inclination, go and look at these things. The thing about these large experiments, and you forget the scale of them, but they take a lot of time to scope, to plan. They take a lot of money, very often lots of permits. They involve lots of people. It's not a solo performance. And the two that I'm going to talk about today they were spearheaded by Environment Canada, both of them, way back in the early days. Environment Canada had only been established a few years. Gary Sergi was a prime mover in all of this, along with Dave Thornton and Peter Blackall, just to give credit where credit is due. When I say a large number of people are involved, this is a list of the participants and BIOS. I'm not going to go through it, but you can see a whole range of government, private sector, industry, university, individuals and groups were involved. The ones I've highlighted because ITOSS was similarly a very large operation with many people involved, and the italicized uppercase things, headline things are ones where the same groups were involved in both studies. Now, the idea for the BIOS, the primary objectives, and I'll just literally quote them, was to quantitatively assess and compare short and long-term effects in three situations. One was chemically dispersed oil, which was released in the nearshore environment, just a few hundred meters off the shoreline. A second slick was released near the shoreline and allowed to strand naturally to be monitored for long-term recovery and persistence. And the third was to look at the effectiveness of shoreline cleanup techniques. And the conclusions, just to jump right over everything, is that, and again, these are quotes from peer-reviewed publication, that the results offered no compelling ecological reasons to prohibit the use of chemical dispersants on nearshore oil slicks in this context. Now, that's a pretty powerful statement to have been made back in 1980, 81, 82. And in parallel with that, for the nearshore, for the shoreline treatment work that was done, the results provided no strong ecological reasons for the cleanup of oil stranded on the shorelines in this situation. Those are both very powerful statements. That's why I wanted to put them right up front. You want to read all about the experiment? There's a special issue of the journal Arctic, 1987. It's all available online these days, and we're so lucky to be able just to go and click a button and find it. ITOSS, the objective here was to specifically look at the effectiveness of selected in situ treatment methods for shoreline cleanup, and to look at the processes that were involved in those treatment methods. One of which was to look at oil and mineral fines, something which had started to emerge as a process shortly after Exxon Valdez in early 1990s. The conclusions from this study in terms of the fate of the treated oil was that the data showed that the treatment methods that were used significantly reduced the persistence of the stranded oil. In other words, you could actually change the natural processes by the natural recovery by intervention. We were particularly looking at secondary effects, and Ken Lee was a really important person here. He was in, he did all the toxicological work associated with this, and he basically, I see later on, his conclusions were that there was no accumulation as a result of this work, and there are no significant benefit accumulations and toxicity levels, and that's what he was looking at as a government researcher. The toxicity levels were within acceptable levels. And he also saw the role of OMAs was verified. All right, so that's the reasons why, and that's the conclusions. Let's look at each of these now individually. So Cape Hat is northern part of Baffin Island. Just to show you and zoom things there. This little place is called Z Lagoon. We named it because it looked like a letter Z or Z, because there's very few place names in the area. The nearest location is a community, mini-metallic, known as Pond Inlet, which has been there for quite some time. And this was the logistics base where we worked through. We did have a main camp, which at one time had 60 people birthed there. There was a Twin Otter airstrip very close, so you could actually bring stuff right into the camp. Lab facilities there for a lot of real-time work that was being conducted. Because of the nature of the sampling for the nearshore disbursement work, a dive camp was also set up at Bay 12. I'll show you where these places are in a minute. And this was a lab was set up there as well, so that the particular sampling that required a constant flow of seawater could be achieved at that location. So you can imagine 60 people, 80 or 78 degrees north, long way from anywhere, major logistics effort. The work was spread out over several years. We set up control plots in 1980. The primary nearshore release, which I'm not going to talk about, which was the chemical dispersion study, that took place in 1981. And after that had been completed, then the nearshore release that allowed natural stranding was also, that also took place August of 81. Most of the intertidal treatment work was conducted in 1982. And then sampling, we went back, as you can see, several years over the time, most recently 2019, an MPRI funded project from NRC was in the area and resampled many of the locations that we already had data from. So we got 50 years of data now, sorry, 40 years of data now. So these were the actual site visits. That picture is the one from August of 2019 from the team sampling there. So we have a good record of, we have a good set of samples and a good record of the changes through time. Again, if you want to, if you've got the time, there's annual reports. I've got them all sitting on my desk over there, and there's a special issue of Arctic, 279 pages of every small part of the general picture, and also each small part of the studies that were undertaken. So the data's still there if anybody wants to look at it. The oil is Largo Medio crude, medium crude, Venezuela. It was artificial aged, 8%. And then for the work that we were doing on the shoreline treatment plots, we had the 8% weather crude, and we also created a 50% oil in water emulsion. We did that on site. The environmental setting is that the lagoon in which we did the treatment plots, that was very sheltered. I mean, just a fetch of a couple of kilometers. Bay 11 was more exposed, but I mean, this is a low energy Arctic environment, still very sheltered, fetch only about 10 kilometers at the most. So we got to put this in the context of where we are. Very little in the way of physical processes, and only a couple of months of open water season. That was 40 years ago. It's longer now. So this is a picture of the actual release. And you can see within the boom, over a period of 6 hours, 15 cubes of Largo Medio crude was released, very carefully time to be on an ebb tide. So the water was flowing out, which is from bottom right to more to the left, and with a very slight onshore breeze. And you can see that the oil literally is just coming ashore without any intervention whatsoever. So sampling and monitoring program, we had set up profile lines and sample stations, and these were then occupied over a period of time. So I didn't have time to actually go through all my slides. So some of these pictures are ones that are scanned from publications rather than the originals. But you can see we've got distribution maps at 81, 2, and 3. So we knew what the actual amounts of the oil were if we're looking at the area and the volume, and then the samples were analyzed to give us some of the chemical properties through time. So this is an actual photograph. This is in August 1983, and you can see, well, the good thing is that in a way the sediments on this shoreline are fairly light colored. They're a sort of a tan colored, so it's very easy to distinguish the dark color of the residual oil sediments. Data, really quickly, I mean, there's a ton of data, but volume, about 50% was refloated in the first 48 hours. And we know that from seeing how much was left on the shoreline from the mapping and how much was recovered on the water. We just didn't, you know, once the first amount of oil had become stranded on the rising tide, we were then recovering the free oil. So we have a pretty good idea, 50% anyway, not 10%, not 90. And in the first 3 open water months, which is the time period of August, September of 81, and then the first part of the summer open water of August 82, about the estimate is 70% of the oil was removed over that time period. When we look at percent oiled area, when we go in the longer time period to 1989, only 20% of the original oiled area, without any intervention at all, was left by 1989. By this time, the oil had actually pretty much disintegrated. There was an actual pavement originally, I'll talk about that in a moment. But by this time, it had disintegrated, so there were only small patches remained, and so no further mapping was done. Natural recovery, one of the samples went up with Gary Sergi and Roger Prince in 2010, very specifically to look at some of the physical and chemical characteristics of the oil on this Bay 11 beach. And again, I'm not going to go through all of this stuff, but what Roger was able to determine from the different samples, there were different degrees of biodegradation that had occurred, and depending on the particular location of where that sample was collected. The asphalt pavement was important because it provided a stabilization of the oil that had been stranded, and it formed within 4 open water months over the 2 seasons. And this is where most of the oil was actually retained. It didn't last that long. By 10 open water months, it was pretty much broken down. And we'll see a little bit later on, I mean, compared to the asphalt pavements that still exist on the Arrow and Matula, these things are still there 50 years later. So maybe this is a function of the location where we've got very cold temperatures in the winter and freeze-thaw processes, which would cause the oil perhaps to expand and contract, and therefore breaking down the physical integrity of it. What we learned, what we did learn basically from out of all of this also is that the oil didn't accumulate in the subtidal. There was an extensive diver program, and so of about the 4 cubic meters that removed from the beach, a very small amount, when you added up everything that was found in the subtidal, it was less than 1,000 to 1%. The lab studies, we didn't know about oil particle interactions in those days, but subsequent studies on field samples showed that this process was in fact an active process. when we were sampling in 1993. So that can explain in part some of the breakdown of the natural attenuation there. In the sampling we did in 2010 with Roger, there was black mobile oil in one of the pits, and this was probably something similar to the sequestered oil that is still, and undisturbed sequestered oil still is in Prince William Sound. The NRC study that was conducted in 2019 was looking in part on some of the residual components, and found that from the intertidal sediments, samples that were collected, those sediments showed none of the potentially toxic priority PAHs. So, and I go back to one of the conclusions that we made back early on, was that there was no justification perhaps for cleaning oil in these shorelines, which is perhaps borne out by this 2019 data. In terms of, sorry, got a bit sensitive here. We were looking at what it comes down to is a 4-stage evolution, just to simplify things, of an initial loss of just a few hours to days, and a more stable period with pavement formation, and thirdly, degradation of that over a period of years, and a subsequent disintegration of the residual, which takes years to days. We try to plot that up in something very simplistic with a log scale on the bottom. And so looking at the short, immediate, intermediate, and long term. And I'm going to come back to this later on as well. So just remember this, something that this was published in 2008 using data from the Arrow, from Prince William Sound, and from the BIOS study. The shoreline treatment, I'm going to have to run through this sort of fairly quickly because the lessons learned were very simple. We had a series of control plots. We had, this is a low energy control plot in 1983. L1, L2, L1 was the crude oil, L2 was the emulsified oil. Backshore control plots, and again, NRC sampled those in 2019. They're still very visible, but they're above the limit of wave action. So they're purely a subaerial terrestrial record of the behavior of that oil over a long period of time. The treatment methods that we used: low pressure flushing. We tried to in situ burn. We used a Department of the DREV, Defense Research Establishment Victoria. Boy, I almost forgot that one. An incendiary device that they had provided. And we used some mixing, and we used 2 chemical dispersants, BP 1100X and Corexit 7664, the ones that were around at that time. And we used a solidifying agent, a BP cross polymer thing. So this is just a plot as they were set up. Don't need to go in detail, but they were oiled in around about the upper part of the intertidal zone. It's just like I scanned it out of one of the papers. This is what the setup looked like during that oiling process. Sampling was very detailed and very systematic. So again, just looking at the way we designed it. The conclusions: flushing wasn't very effective on the low energy beaches. Mixing reduced surface oil concentrations quite quickly. And the solidifiers were basically a waste of time. And I'll show you one in a minute. The dispersants worked well to reduce the surface oil concentrations. And the combustion didn't work at all, even though it had temperatures exceeding 1500 degrees C. So this is just a picture of the burns that we did. I say very high flame temperatures. We did 3 tests, and bottom right, there's a little ash around, but the only oil that was burned was basically the oil that was directly underneath that small square of the incendiary device. The solidifier, well, I don't know if I'm on screen, but I've still got some of that solidifier. It's just been sitting on my shelf along with a lot of other pieces of rubbish and things collected over the years, but it's called a solidifier because it basically solidified, encapsulated the oil, and what was at the time a rubber type of, it's slightly malleable, but over time just became solid. So we learned a lot, and we used that information developing treatment manuals and going through the years. But late 1990s, we wanted to understand a lot more about in situ treatment, particularly in remote areas, which is pretty much all of Canada, pretty much all of Alaska. I mean, you don't want to be picking up large volumes of oil material, you don't want to be generating large volumes of waste, and you don't want to have high intensity effort in terms of the labor and logistics, life support that's required. So we started looking at in situ treatment techniques, and we're fortunate to be able to get a site in Svalbard, in part of northern Norway. It's still it's in Van Mayen Field near a community called Svea. And as I mentioned at the beginning, the objectives were to look at the effectiveness of in situ treatment and look at the fate of oil and to investigate the role of mineral fines. So this is Svea. I really have to say it's one of the most beautiful places. Svalbard is one of the most beautiful places I've ever been. And people ask you, what's your favorite place? Well, there's many, but the sheer beauty of this in the summer and the winter is really it's just firmly fixed in my memory. The site was a coal mining operation, huge coal mines throughout Svalbard. This one, it's closed a couple of times. The last time it was closed, and basically all the facilities were dismantled. It was just a couple of years ago. But at the time, it had quite a large workforce and an active landing strip, so it's quite easy to get in and out of there. The fuel, the oil that we used at this time was an IFO 30. We used about just over 5 cubic meters of it. So the setup here, open sea is to the bottom left. We had 3 sites. One was the lowest energy. Again, it's all relative. 2 was a little bit more exposed, and 3 was the most exposed. But as you know, this is a low energy Arctic environment. So sampling. Now we spent a tremendous amount of time planning what to do and how to do it and how to get quantitative, meaningful results. And so we ended up with our sample size being variously between about 1 and 2 kilograms. And these were extracted on site. So again, the setup is really quite a tremendous amount of effort. I mean, so we were doing the on-site extraction for the bioremediation work that was being done. The water was being analyzed immediately for dissolved oxygen salinity, temperature, and CO2, and other things. Toxicity samples were collected and frozen and sent off-site for analysis. But all of this had to be really carefully orchestrated. In addition, the timing was when to put oil on a shoreline. So this is a tidal cycle over the period in which the oiling and the treatment were taking place. So I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but this is the sort of the upper edge of the intertidal zone going up towards a spring tide. And so on sites 1 and 2, the oil was laid down and on the left-hand red oval there, and a period of several days was allowed for natural attenuation. I mean, you don't just put oil down on plots and treat it right away. The real world, there's a delay time while the deployment takes place. And so we allowed for several days of just natural attenuation before we then undertook our treatments. And all of these were on a rising, increasingly higher tidal, rising high tide water levels. So this is site 1. This is the lowest of the energy environments. This location, we had a control plot and we did sediment relocation, and the loading was, as you can see, about 7.5 liters per square meter. The setup, sediment was relocated. This is just a map, a plan. So A, the control plot, and B, moving the sediment down to about the neat low water level. And then this shows the sampling plan that was associated with that particular activity. Site 2, a little bit more exposed. This was a combination now of tilling with bioremediation, adding a fertilizer, and bioremediation on its own. And what you can see here, this is a good picture. Again, it's scanned off the published literature, but using, excuse me, a spray bar to evenly distribute the oil. And you can see these plots are pretty decent size, you know, the tens of meters in length. And the loading on these was 5 liters per meter squared. And the sampling setup for those particular plots. So 12 samples each time we sample. That's where you get up into the kilograms of a sample, because these are then homogenized, whichever is the right word. Sediment relocation at site 2, moving the sediment down the beach, bit of mixing, and here's a very expensive gardener using a very expensive tool to distribute the slow release soluble fertilizer. He knows who he is. Site 3, this is the very large plots now. We're dealing a couple of 100 meters long with a loading of 10 liters per square meter. And you can see this, half of these plots were, see in the plan, half of the plots were above the spring high water level. So in fact, most of them. So the control was above the limit of wave action. So this was intended to mimic something like a deposition during a spring tide or a high water level event. And so the relocation using this little bobcat moved the oil down towards the low water level, and actually the neat low water level. And again, our sampling procedure. So pretty rigorous set of sampling controls, tons of data. I mean, there's not only the concentrations of the oil, but we had depth of penetration within the sediments. We're comparing, in this case, some of the bioremediation data, the microtox data, looking at the formation of oil mineral particles. I mean, there's a lot of information. I'm going to stick to the bits that I know about and perhaps some of the key results. But on the mixing plot, site 2, this is on the left is the treatment plot, and then on the right here, no treatment plot E. So after 60 days, the numbers of the concentrations of loading are about the same. But there was a huge difference because the number on the mixing plot went down very quickly and stayed very low. It took a much longer time period. And this is where recovery and exposure to resources is important. This intervention reduced the exposure time period. The same with sediment relocation at site 3. I mean, the loading went down from something like over 8,000 grams per meter squared to just a few, and stayed that low, whereas the control plot, the no treatment plot, stayed high throughout the entire period. The other thing that it was interesting because I'm looking at the data the other day. You know, like I say, you remember things, but you don't remember everything. I just started looking at the data a little bit more, and we never really plotted how the volumes of oil based on those samples changed through time. And I started looking at the data, and all of a sudden I'm really surprised to find that at that time we didn't plot out what was the natural removal on the plots. And you know, it was such a rigorous sampling in terms of design and the size of the samples. I think this is really great data, and what it's showing is at site 1 and site 2 we're getting down within 10 days after it should be after oiling, not after treatment. After oiling, I need to correct that. We were down to less than 40% on site 1 and less than 10% on site 2. And then the next data point is way out of 60 days. So we go back to the plot that I showed you earlier. And if we add in this data, which had never been processed, never been looked at in this way before, all of those trend lines, now we've gone to a log scale, they're all well below that sort of big, thick red line that we had earlier, and showing that, in fact, yes, there is a rapid natural lifting buoyancy, removal, whatever term you want to use. The critical time period is the first 10 probably to, first 2 months anyway, 50 days. Sorry about that. I turned it off, I thought. But you can see here now we've actually added on some much more interesting data by bringing in this data from Svalbard. So the other thing, just to go finish up here, I gave you the conclusions at the beginning, but we didn't find oil along shore, didn't find it in the near shore and the benthic sediments, or in the suspended particles that were found in the water column. So it's not like the mixing and the sediment relocation didn't extend the oiling. In fact, it reduced the oiling in all of these environments. It's not my place to summarize some of the other work, but I'll just do a quickie for a couple of the things. The bioremediation significantly reduced the amount of oil because of the much greater rate of biodegradation. In fact, almost doubled over the period of the year. And again, we were doing toxicity with no adverse toxicological effects. Ken Lee's job mentioned he found no evidence of long-term, which is a year. We're thinking of a year. Went back, after one more year to collect more samples. No toxicity detected in the breaker zone, the near shore, and the benthics. 1 year later, the oil sediments from the untreated plots, however, did continue to generate a toxic response. The other point we were looking at was what was oil mineral aggregates, now referred to by some as oil colloidal particle aggregates, but we found these on the beach. I say Ken found these on the beach and found that they were enhanced by the sediment relocation and mixing processes. And this leads us then to extrapolate, when we're looking at now, what does all this mean? There's several things that this means. First of all, we now know better that as wave energy levels reduce, which is the blue line, so the role of these mineral finds starts to increase. So in areas of decreasing energy, then we're getting a shift in the emphasis from one primary process, which is physical wave action, to then something which is associated with the behavior of the mineral and oil particles. And this looks like when you start to extrapolate, what does this mean in terms of what are the relative contributions to the natural attenuation of oil? And the thing is that BIOS and ITOSS have enabled us to start developing these types of removal curves, with waves being important in the first hours, tides, buoyancy, and washout. That's a big lesson from BIOS. And then biodegradation and the fine particle oil mineral thing becomes important over a much longer time period. So we've got a better handle on the processes. I say all of this has been written up. There's a special issue on the Svalbard field experiments, published in all peer-reviewed stuff, published in 2003. The conclusions mentioned these: stranded oil persistence was reduced, minimal secondary effects, and OMA was there. And so what do we extrapolate from this is that, okay, in areas where mechanical manual removal is perhaps not preferred, not the favored technique because of high use of labor, particularly in remote areas, or high amounts of waste generation, then in situ treatment offers better solution. It's more operationally practical and efficient. And this intervention, I say, remember, after 60 days, the numbers, oil concentrations and loadings were pretty much the similar, but it's reducing that exposure time that is really the critical thing. If you can reduce that exposure time when the oil is, it's still at least weathered, then you can actually accelerate recovery. This is a graphic just to try and show that. With natural attenuation on the brown line, you get to where you want to be, on this particular scenario on August the 1st. But if you can get there quicker by removal, by in situ treatment, If you can get down to this 90% removal level much quicker, then you've reduced the exposure time that the resources in that area would have to be with that oil. All right, that was really quick. I got 15 minutes left. I'm going to add a little bit more here because, again, when I started thinking about this, these aren't the only things that we know that have importance in the long term. The arrows, that goes back 50 years. And we, fortunately, this was one of the, before Environment Canada, but we were fortunate that the Bedford Institute of Oceanography, which is not so far away, a couple of hours drive away, mobilized all of the scientists and got them out on the water and on the beaches and to conduct scientific work. And this has enabled us to have a baseline that we've looked at over the years. I sort of jokingly call this the first scat map, which was the spill was in February of 1970, and this is a map that was produced of the oiling conditions in June of that year. We also did another map in August of 1973. So we're sort of looking at, again, hardly any intervention. Most of this was natural recovery. And we went back in 1992 and walked the entire shoreline again, and found, in fact, if we 300 kilometers of shoreline, of which 247 was surveyed, 13 of which still had some degree of oil. Most of this, actually, a good portion of it was very light, but there were patches still of what we would categorize as heavy and moderate oil in the area. And you can still go and see some of these places. In fact, Gary Sergi and I went back there in 92, Rabbit Island and a few up Jamming Island, and actually sampled these. Black Duck Cove is a special, I should tell you where Black Duck Cove is. It's a little location in here. It was oiled. Say the spill was in February. There was almost no oil in this whole region past Canso. This is the town of Canso. But one slick came ashore in April. Had been out at sea for a long time. And this has been studied, as you can see, all those years. We've been back many times. Ken Lee's been back. Roger's been there. We've sampled it. We've got a good understanding of what's been happening there. In fact, it's been so long, Bob Taylor did this, that looking at the features on this outer Boulder Beach, look at the size of these sediments. This has actually migrated, the crest of this has migrated about just over 10 meters since the early 1990s. Well, 1970 was probably about here. Again, it's not surveyed, but the way that we're looking at distances to trees and other features is, it's probably gone back 20 meters over that total 50-year period. Again, it's a natural laboratory. It's still sitting right out there. And the other one, less well known, is in the Straits of Magellan, the Metula oil spill, which took place in '74. And Miles Hayes and his team did a tremendous amount of work there right after the spill. And in a couple of years afterwards, in fact, the most recent visit there by Eric Gunlack was in 2015. Environment Canada supported site visits by myself with Gary Sergi, Wish Robson and Jenny Baker and other people in 77. I have to preface 1977, 87 and 98, and then again in 2005. So we've got a good time series data. And the interesting thing, particularly in my view about Metula, is that Jenny Baker had set up some test plots with different treatment activities in 1993. And we were able to resurvey them and to look at the recovery data from the plants and the reduction in the amount of oil, both at these sites and some other sites that Gary Sergi and I had set up. We set those up in oh crikey, I guess we set them up in 98. And this is just it's an aerial picture from Eric of the original type of oiling. There's a marsh and there's a pebble cobble beach, but these are the plots that Jenny Baker had set up in 93 with a photograph of 2005. One of the asphalt pavements that we've monitored over the years that looked like this 30 years later. So Wonder what it looks like now, 45 years later. So the legacy, what comes out of all of this? I mean, there's a lot, I'm chomping through a lot of stuff and a lot of things, but in essence, there's some good lessons that we have learned, and those lessons are based on good data. I know techniques have changed. Analytical techniques are more sophisticated these days, but that doesn't mean to say that that data that was collected back in 1980s and 90s isn't still good data. It was collected with a very rigorously thought out sampling plan to make sure that the results are still today scientifically valid, statistically valid. It'd be really hard to reproduce any more of these types of experiments. It takes about a lot of effort, a lot of money, and you've got to find somewhere to do it. I think Svalbard might be off limits these days. Nobody's spilled any oil up there for quite some time. We're on the shorelines anyway. And it's not possible. I mean, there were toxicity studies, there's biodegradation, bioremediation studies, many studies that took place as components of these. And it's not possible just to go through each and do justice to each of these. The bottom line that comes out of all this is that because we've got good data and also long-term studies, when we start talking during an oil spill now about what are the better, more favorable techniques versus other options, we can confidently give advice now. It's science-based advice. So this picture on the right is down in Peru just this last, whatever, March, April. You know, we went to mixing and sediment relocation. And the local government agencies are not familiar with these. And so we then provided evidence, scientific evidence from the papers and explained. And we were able then to justify the reasons why this mixing and sediment relocation would accelerate recovery rather than delay recovery, because when we arrived there, something on the order of 30,000 cubic meters of oiled sand had been removed from the beaches. And that was not having we didn't think it was going to be a geologically good idea to keep on doing that. So because we had this data going back, because it's been published in referee journals, we were able then to justify those recommendations, the advice and the recommendations that were provided. And that's really the legacy, in fact, of these two, the BIOS and the ITOSS studies. So today, there's places to go and still to learn. I mean, we can go back to Prince William Sound. There's sequestered oil. It's not, again, it's not an environmental risk. There's BIOS. The intertidal oil that's there is not a biological risk. It's still there. And the same is true for the Arrow. Not quite sure about the Metula. We haven't done any toxicological work down there for a long time. But if you want to learn, you can go. There's 4 sites that are all accessible. One way or another, this is a little bit more difficult. You can drive by road to the Arrow sites, and you can drive by road to the Metula sites. They're still there. They're still waiting for us to learn more. And with that, I'd entertain any questions. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Ed. And I understand, you know, it takes a lot of time to do this. So once again, I really appreciate you putting the time and pulling all these slides together and, you know, scratching your head long enough to remember everything. And yeah, you were able to do a great job of memory there, which probably I wouldn't be able to do when I'm over 60. I wanted to mention that, so I told you earlier, but Gary Sergi has volunteered to talk about the nearshore experiments from BIOS, and he's going to take him a while to put together slides because he had an incident with his computer and lost all his files, unfortunately, which is terrible. But hopefully sometime early next year, we'll get Gary to talk about the nearshore experiments. And so while there's some questions that are coming in here, and I'll read those in a second, but I'll take the prerogative here of asking a couple. And when I look at especially this map you have up here, we have the tropics study, which is in a much warmer climate, but it seems like there's bias towards kind of relatively extreme environments for these, well, the spills that have been studied more meticulously, but then the planned experiments as well. What's the reason for that? Why aren't we having, why aren't people going to Tampa and other places where there's been, significant spills and significant shoreline impacts, or do those have reports and studies done on them over time as well, and they're just not listed here?
Yeah, I think that last point's important. I mean, there are places to go. Buzzards Bay has a hotspot, which has been sampled and looked at over the years, and it still can be sampled, but it's a few meters square, maybe. I don't know the exact dimensions. The thing about Metula is it's a kilometer or two. The arrow tends to a couple of 100 meters. It's the scale of being able to look at something like that. A lot of the places have been cleaned up. There's a lot of places that have oil that we don't know because the spills were never documented and not reported properly. So the thing about these sites is that we've got data, science data of one form or another from the very beginning. And that enables us to look at both the natural attenuation and natural recovery. And that's what sets them apart. You could have a really big patch of oil somewhere in the tropics, with respect to in a warm environment. The Red Sea and the Arabian Gulf have got asphalt pavements. I mean, there's an asphalt pavement up in Qatar. I've been, every time I go there, I'll fly over it to walk on it. It's been there for years and years, but we don't know where it came from. We don't know, the timing. We have no data that we can use then to look at the longer term situation and come up with something meaningful. So it's really, these places were studied by scientists at the beginning, and that's the baseline.
Okay. I mean, the other thing that's interesting is there's a lot of variables here, but these plan studies, the BIOS and ITOSS, it seems like you purposely went to a low energy environment. Maybe that's just because it's easier to do research in a low energy environment, probably. But there's a lot of variables, but it looks like, looking at the arrow compared to those shorelines, right? Sandy, coarse sand beaches, even in a low energy environment, the oil wasn't as persistent, but it looks like, looking at these large boulders for the arrow study, that could be one variable that has a correlation between directly with the persistence. Is there something to do with the arrow oil or the Metula oil that makes it more persistent, or is it really the nature of the shoreline that's the strongest factor on the persistence? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's location. I mean, the pictures on the right here, that's Ted Bent's after a hurricane that exhumed. Those boulders were thrown 10 meters by wave action. Now that was a bunker C. The Metula oil was a light medium Arabian crude, but in a low energy environment. We don't have enough different environments, coastal process environments, to make to make good models. I mean, we've got bits and pieces from here and there, and that's what we have done so far. I think the location's important. They're in low energy environments because there isn't that physical energy to break it down. And with the arrow oil, because it was a bunker C, a pretty heavy oil, almost semi-solid now. It's some of the arrow spilled just 2-3 years ago, and that on open beaches, a lot of that was naturally removed quite quickly. But it's only when it penetrated into the sediments and formed asphalt pavements that it has persisted. I just don't think we have enough data from different environments. Where we have data, we often just clean things up, and that doesn't doesn't help the science, helps the environment, but it doesn't give us the picture.
Okay, and we have, questions are coming in now fast, but let me ask one more. So you mentioned the solidifiers, but I didn't know if maybe I didn't hear, but what was the issue with the solidifiers? They didn't solidify, looked like they solidified, but it was the challenges of recovering them afterwards, or what was the problem with the solidifiers? And
well, you had to mix them. I mean, you had to literally, with rakes and shovels, you had to mix the polymers in with the sediments, and then when it's solidified, you can pick it up. It's just a tremendous amount of effort that it took to do that. And it's okay for a plot that's a meter by meter, but you've got something that's 50 meters or 100 meters. The level of effort is, there's other things that you can do better and quicker, like mixing and sediment relocation, that actually get rid of most of the oil and reduce that exposure time.
okay, great. All right, do you have the Q&A up? I'll go through these questions. We have a few questions now, but let me start at the top here. The first question is, you mentioned that there were no strong indications to not use dispersants and other treatment options. Is there any chance that the monitoring and analytical techniques that were available at the time were unable to resolve concentrations that we may now be concerned about?
I can't answer that question. I didn't do that part of it, but I think everybody agreed. You know, the concentration levels, and I'd have to look it up. I mean, they were measuring parts per million easily, and maybe Lars and some of those from NRC that were up there this last 2019 will be looking at the components that are left. There's only some draft material that Lars Schreiber was kind enough to share with me before this talk, and I mean, the intertidal sediments, the lack of PAH is one of the things that has emerged from the intertidal sediments. They're still there in the terrestrial backshore control plots. But going back to the chemistry question, I think the chemists would argue that what they did at the time generated statistically valid data that is still valid today.
Okay, I mean, I'd suggest that I think the question's focused on dispersants, and then the PAH concentrations that were extremely low that were found in lab studies to cause harm after the Deepwater Horizon spill, and we're in the parts per billion TPAH concentrations. But I would suggest that if we did have that resolution back then, you would have found that, this is my opinion, that you would have found that those concentrations in the nearshore waters persisted longer for the oil that was washed onto the beach rather than dispersed, because there's a long-term source, even though it wasn't persistent for years and years on those beaches at BIOS, but certainly longer than the oil that was actually effectively dispersed. And in an open system like that, it couldn't persist very long at any concentration, right? But if you have a shoreline source, those PAHs can leach out of the shoreline oil for long periods of time.
Well, I mean, this is why it'd be great to get Gary or somebody else who was involved, like William Cross or Norm Snow, some of those scientists that were responsible for that part of the BIOS project are the ones to debate this.
Yep. Okay, second question. You mentioned that little impact toxicity was noted in the nearshore bottom environment associated with the dispersant application. This is contrary to that reported with the tropics project, where significant seagrass and coral impacts were noted with dispersed oil. Any ideas on the difference?
Again, I wasn't on the dispersant program at all. And the only thing I can actually add to address that question is there are a lot of benthic samples collected of, the infauna. honestly, I have to refer to the papers that were written at the time.
Yeah, so we'll have hopefully Gary in a few months, so maybe we can hold that question and get some thoughts from Gary,
Yeah.
Sergi on what if there was a difference.
Yeah, I've learned not to talk about dispersants and fish many years ago. So leave it to people that know about dispersants and fish.
Okay, next question then. How specific do we need to be with the fertilizer mix applied for bioremediation? Any food is good food, or is there a magic mix based on oil type, location, other? Question mark.
Oh, that's a good one. I have to defer to Michel Bouffadel and Roger Prince, people who've done that work. You know, on Prince William Sound, we just used a normal fertilizer that you would use on your lawn, and I think we used pretty much the same one up in the ITOSS experiment. So is there a better food for different oil type or for the different bacteria with different oil types? I don't know. Again, I think Roger probably does know a lot more about that. Yeah, I know he knows a lot more about it.
I'm sure he has some thoughts. I'm looking to see if he's on the. If he isn't,
Well,
but
Roger does also. He also has opinions, which are very good.
just like you and me. I would guess that the answer would be the one that's available is the
Right.
best answer for the best fertilizer. But I know that they took some off-the-shelf products, and it had a significant, you know, even with the bio study and without these incident, the plots that were fertilized were vastly improved.
Yeah.
Much more quickly. Let's see, sure I don't miss something here. Okay, is there a standard guide process for how we can implement longer term studies in future incidents? A guide on how to gather better data from the onset of a spill to after response operations, as well as the natural attenuation process? That's a good question.
Yeah, I think I've got a book up there which talks about standard handbook oil spill environmental forensics, authored by Stout and Wang, and it's a collection of many papers from many authors, which looks at exactly that. How do you actually do the initial forensic work on an oil spill, and then how do you design and implement a monitoring program? Because there's many facets to it. I mean, there's looking at the physical processes as well as the chemistry and you know the biological side of it. But there's a book there that gives the answer much better than I could ever.
Oh, I don't know about that if you put your mind to it. But when was that book written? Is that after DWH or is before?
Oh, yeah, second edition. Let me look. So the first edition, 2007, and second edition was 2016. So pretty up to date. I mean, it's thick, you know, gives you something to read if you've got the time.
Okay.
That's the trouble. It's so much to read. But yeah, I mean, you know, you have to design everything has to be designed for purpose. But there's some basics, and to me, on a shoreline, it's area and volume. Those are the things that I look at, amounts. And then with colleagues who are toxicologists or biologists, and you know, they would be doing their own part of that program would be doing their separate measurements.
Yeah, you know, a book like that is probably a good read when you're insomniac or something, but maybe you know, we need a shorter checklist that someone can go through quickly to set up a study at, you know, during a spill when there may not be, you know, the person who's read the tome there.
Yeah, exactly.
So they can capture the time zero data, right? That's key. That's key to these long-term studies is the time, you know, effectively
Right.
rising the site at the beginning, or even before the beginning would be great, but
that's I think that's a key point where, you know, the explosion of knowledge these days, it makes it harder to get back to basic principles. And that's some of those graphs that I've showed they're not, they're empirical, but they're based on a lot of many people's experience over the years. And it must be very hard for somebody who's new to the profession to filter out what are the most important pieces, what are the most important things to do when you've got all sorts of analytical tools these days with GCMSs and other. That's about all I can remember. I mean, they've got GCMSs, TSs, and other things these days. I don't know what they do, but the choices now are so well, they're challenging. I mean, got to keep it simple, basic data. It must be hard to try and figure out because we don't have these simple checklists that you mentioned.
Yeah, so there may be some room for a short 3 or 4 page document that describes kind of here's the fundamentals, and then points to that big book,
Right.
For adding in some of the details in certain aspects of it. But
Right.
yeah, that book looks like it may be very good for the guy who wants to write a PhD, but
Yeah.
somebody who needs to design
Well,
something on the fly, it may not cut the mustard.
API have done a good job in that sense over the past few years. I mean, Michel Bouffardel's got one on biodegradation and bioremediation. It's called a primer for managers and responders, and that's designed to do that. We did job aids and fact sheets for mixing and sediment relocation. And then Jackie and Nicole Rutherford did a good one on marshes. And these are syntheses of a lot of material in a few pages. And those are a great starting point.
Yeah, so maybe we should think about that, a scan and glance type of document to help, make sure you understand the big picture issues and you have the bullet point list of what you need to consider, and then fill in the rest by reading other documents that are referenced in a scan and glance type document. Maybe we should think about that, because I don't think the IPICA documents are focused on helping somebody design a study and make sure that the important aspects are captured at the beginning. So
Yeah.
something to think about. Okay, here's our last question. What is the next big question you would like to study in regards to ITOSS? For example, what new technology to trial or information gap to fill?
Cool. Good question. I have to think about that. I mean, my immediate response is, we answered the big questions. I think the one that's still probably out there is you brought up the point, Tim, about for different environments. I mean, we looked at low energy, mixed sediment, pebble, cobble beaches. There's many other types of shore types. We haven't looked at sand beaches, for example. So I think my answer would be to try and repeat some of the work that we've already done, but in different habitats or different environments. I think that would be the most important thing, is to expand the knowledge base rather than looking at revisiting some of the techniques that we've already looked at in detail, expand the applications of those into other places.
I'll tell you the new tech. So we talked about the jet ski we have, and the jet ski, the remote controlled jet ski,
Yeah,
the autonomous jet ski. We're developing it to hold a bunch of tools, and it's got in situ burning capabilities, but that's offshore, right? And but it's a great platform for remote sensing, right? And it's going to have this amphibious it's being put on it as we speak, but an amphibious helicopter that can, remote controlled or drone type helicopter that can come off the back of the jet ski and go up to 400 feet in the air, or it can go, I don't know if we could take it 400 feet below the water, but it can go subsea, right? It can go underwater.
mm-hmm.
But a new technology, and keep this in mind if there's an opportunity, but I think that jet ski is a great tool for SCAT, because it can be on the water for 50 hours without being refueled, and it can keep that 100 feet in the air, that that tethered UAV in the air to collect, and it can be floating in 3 feet of water. So it could get pretty close to shorelines that would be pretty challenging to get to with a person or a dog. And it could do a pretty good scat survey and give you live feed video of those shorelines pretty quickly. So that's a new technology, and I'd like, we need to think about how we can explore the potential to use that to help support some of these shoreline evaluations in the future. And right now we don't really have plans to do that, but just that is, I think it's a powerful tool, and it allows quick scans and long term, right? It can go for hours and hours and hours and collect data on the water side and on the shore side with the cameras to do that. So that should be a tool that's available. Hopefully it'll be available for a spill that hopefully a spill that happens in 2023, 2024 timeframe. So that's technology I'd be enthusiastic to try out.
Yeah, I would. And we've worked with Chevron to do image analysis for reconnaissance scat surveys using uncrewed aircraft, small drones and things like that. And the trick there is processing the information and training up people who can interpret those images quickly. And that's a project that we've been talking about for a little while to get started. Having a better tool to analyze the data. I mean, getting the data is great, and what your concepts there are great for getting the data. Then the next step is, how can we get to use it quickly and get the most out of it?
And the jet ski has, it has even satellite communication, so it doesn't need to be guy, even in the command center. It could be someone with expertise around the planet, basically, and can get those live feed images immediately to do that kind of analysis. So, but if there's, we're scratching our heads about what kind of cameras and tools, but if there's a specific kind of camera that would support those the scat assessments, let me know, and we need to think about employing those into the system, actually. Okay. Gosh, I feel kind of lost here because Lynn is usually on ball with, I'm not even sure who we have on board next month. Oh, one thing I was going to mention, and this is just so everybody keeps Ken Lee in their thoughts and prayers, but Ken, I believe last week underwent open heart surgery, and I think I've heard that from multiple sources, so I don't think it's a secret. So I'm sharing it. So keep him in his thoughts, keep him in your thoughts and prayers, because he's having, I believe, bypass surgery done, which I think he's had done before. So I had a couple of emails with him. He seems to be in pretty good spirits about it, but hopefully he'll be back in business, because I have him on the schedule coming up as well. So stay tuned for an update. Lynn will send out an email with I do believe we have somebody lined up, but it might have been Ken, and we may have to postpone that for obvious reasons next month. But anyway, thank you everybody for your time, and Ed, thank you very much for putting all the hard work into doing this and answering all these questions. So we'll see everybody next time.
Thank you.